Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next common grammar mistake. And so this is count versus non-count nouns. This is a very common error that I see in my native English speaking students in composition classes. But where I see it even more often is with ESL students and international students whose first language is usually not English. So this is common among those students because it can be very confusing in distinguishing between count versus non-count nouns. For a lot of things like that, you have to understand the context of the word and its application, not just the meaning of the word. And that can get really tricky. So let's look at how to break it down, why the mistake is made, how to correct the mistake, and how to avoid the mistake in the future. So this lecture includes what count versus non-count nouns are, how these mistakes are made through the examples, and how to correct the mistakes in the examples. Then you'll complete the exercise at the end of this lecture, so you will know how to apply corrections to your own writing. So what do we mean when we talk about count nouns versus non-count nouns? It's probably easiest just to read this, so bear with me. I try not to read directly off the screen the whole time because that can get boring. And so I want to read it this time because it's easier just to follow, and then we'll talk about it. A count noun can be used in plural form and a non-count noun in singular form. Count nouns are usually groups of individual things, while non-count nouns are collectives. For example, count nouns are birds, leaves, rakes, and non-count nouns are juice, air, and money. In other words, the first one, count nouns, are individual things. You can count them. And non-count nouns are collectives, or they're more than one thing, but they're considered one thing together. For example, air. You have air molecules, but unless you're talking about molecules, you're just going to say air. That's common sense. And if you're not familiar with English and how it applies, it might be a little more confusing for non-native speakers. So with some adjectives, the word used can matter. For example, when I say I saw many cats, not much cats, that is an example of how you use a correct non-count descriptor or count descriptor. So she has little space in the house, not few space. So the descriptor that you use will make a difference depending on what the noun is that it's describing. So let's look at examples of correct count and non-count noun usage. Non-count. Joe didn't get much done at work. And a count noun. Kira lost a few pennies when she got a hole in her pocket. So what is the mistake that people can make here? Those are correct. For example, Joe didn't get much done at work. Much being what he meant to get done at work. It wasn't an individual thing with a bunch of them put together. Okay, let's start over. So let's look at examples of correct count and non-count noun usage. An example of correct non-count usage, Joe didn't get much done at work. Much is the amount of work he did not get done. Since work is not individual units of things, it is one thing overall. Much is a correct word to use there because it describes it in a non-count way. Count nouns. Kira lost a few pennies when she got a hole in her pocket. Pennies can be counted individually, literally, and so they are count nouns, and so a few pennies is the correct descriptor of what she lost, which is pennies, okay? So this may still be a little confusing, so bear with me. Let's go ahead and look at the mistake, and that will help clear it up some, hopefully. Here are examples of count and non-count noun mistakes. Example 1. Francois left much papers on the counter. Papers has an S here. So papers, you could imply, are individual things. If you have a stack of papers, maybe you count them, there's 12 papers. Okay? So those are individual things. If you were to say paper without the S, it would be correct. But since you're saying papers, you're counting them as individual units. So much describes non-count things. Since papers here can be counted, you would say many. Francois left many papers on the counter. But if you were to say paper, you would use much. Francois left much paper on the counter. Does that make sense? It's dividing the two by number or describing them as a collective. Describing them as a collective is non-count, and that would be paper, and it would be much. If you divide them into individual papers, they become count nouns, and so you would say many papers. Number 2, I have few time before the deadline. That obviously doesn't make any sense, but in this case, time is a collective, so it would be a non-count noun. And so you would say, I have little time, or something to that effect. But few would imply something that is a count. For example, I have few pencils left in the classroom. Those are individual things. Time is a collective, so it's non-count. So you would want to use a non-count descriptor. So few would be incorrect. Let's look at how to correct these. Why are these two examples incorrect? Papers are individual units, and thus they're count nouns. Much is an adjective for non-count nouns like paper as a collective. Example 2, time is not an individual unit. If you were to say minutes, for example, that's individual, but time is not. It's collective. So it's a non-count noun. Few is an adjective for count nouns, so it is incorrect. How do we correct the count and non-count errors? So those are the incorrect ones. Let's look at how to fix those errors. Give the non-count nouns non-count adjectives and give the count nouns count adjectives. The application here is very easy to figure out, but which words are count and non-count? You just have to memorize those and know which are which. And I know that's not the answer you're looking for. If you're an ESL student, knowing those differences is important. And so let's look at how to apply these here. Okay, the corrections. Francois left many papers on the counter. Excuse me, I said in the counter. Many papers on the counter. Papers is plural, and it's individual in this case, so it is a count noun. If it were paper, non-count, the phrase would be much paper. So you could either say Francois left many papers on the counter, or you could say Francois left much paper on the counter. Does that make sense? Paper is non-count, and much describes a non-count word. Papers is count, and so many is a count word, and that's how you can know what matches what in this case. Number 2, I have little time before the deadline. Time is singular and non-count, thus it uses a non-count noun. And little is correct here, not few. Few is count, and little is non-count. Since time is a non-count noun, you would use little to describe it. I know this particular lecture is a little confusing, and so if you have any questions, please feel free to email me in the course. Please feel free to reach out to me. And if you need to go back and read and listen through this lecture again. It'll help clarify some of this for you. And then if you practice with the exercises at the end of the lecture, go to the next lecture and do that, and that will help to clarify this a little bit for you more. Keep in mind there are a lot of count nouns and there are a lot of adjectives that are describe count nouns. There are a lot of non-count nouns and adjectives that describe those. And so studying those in depth is the best way to learn it if you're a non-native English speaker. And most people who speak English natively just need to be more mindful. And in most cases, you know which is which. Just Google count versus non-count adjectives and nouns, and you'll get all kinds of great resources. Okay, so thank you so much for following along on this. I know it can be a little confusing lecture, and I look forward to working with you in the next one. Thank you for your time.